All right, welcome back to the lectures on the Nicomachean Ethics. Now in book 6, chapter 1. So right at the beginning of another book in this most excellent work of Aristotle. So far we've seen Aristotle cover a number of topics. He shifts gears now, and we'll shift with him. He sits back and says, I'm going to criticize a few of my previous remarks. So Aristotle is, as some scholars like to say, a good example of a philosopher at work. He looks at other ideas, looks at other people, he looks at their works, etc., etc. And he also pauses and reflects on what he said and modifies or tinkers with it or whatnot, or criticizes it as he's doing here. So he looks at his previous remarks and says, okay, I've told you guys when I'm talking about doing ethics, you should be rationally choosing the mean, you should avoid excess and deficiency, and that this mean is selected by the notion of right reason, and the mean is what a reasonable person chooses. Now, in this sense, Aristotle admits that he's warned us a lot about the different levels of rigor in different disciplines, and he said repeatedly that you can't expect the mathematical rigor in ethics, and likewise it would be foolish to do that, and likewise it would be foolish to allow the level of rigor that's appropriate to ethics be employed in mathematics. Nonetheless, he says, what I've told you so far seems to be problematic. He gives a little example and he says, well, suppose you're sick and you get some advice about medical science, like what should you do about your ailments? Well, you should apply the medicines in such a way that you avoid deficiencies, avoid excesses, hit at the mean, and do it as a medical practitioner like a doctor would do it. Is that all that helpful? Aristotle says, well, it's not gonna harm you in any way, but it's not going to do you that much good. It's not going to be that terribly helpful. These things seem to be a little bit too broad. We need something a little bit more to this. Now, so Aristotle says, what's the real root of the problem? Well, the real root of the problem so far is that all the discussions about character and whatnot have used this notion of right reason. And so the root of the problem is, what exactly is right reason? What are we supposed to make of that? What is right reason? What do we mean by that? It's critical. It's absolutely necessary in doing ethics, but what does right reason mean? Well, Aristotle says, look, we're going to have to dig into this because the notion of ethics is putting together all the parts of what it means to be unique, a human being, all the unique aspects of what it is to be human. And of course, as we saw earlier, that's really tying into Aristotle's notion of soul, because the whole idea of eudaimonia is kind of to get your soul in order. But if you recall, Aristotle has a very broad notion of soul. That is, that there are various parts to it. And there are parts that we share with other creatures, parts that we share with animals. They're not, as we would say today, Aristotle says animals. We would say non-human animals. So we would share certain parts, certain kinds, or certain parts of the soul with non-human animals, and we also share certain parts of the soul with plants. So, for example, if you recall from an earlier video, all of us, all living creatures, share a part of soul that's nutritive, growth, reproductive, things like that. Living creatures make copies of themselves. They live and they grow. Fine. Animals share a little bit more with us because they have perceptions kind of like we do, or more accurately put, they have sensations like we do. And then, of course, we have some parts of soul that they don't. So Aristotle says, before I can get into all of this, before I can really jump into the problem of what right reason is, I have to, shall we say, go back and review a little bit on the nature of soul, which I have in these sort of groovy 60-ish, 70s lettering. So what's the nature of soul? Well, let's go back. Start with the big picture. The whole idea of soul, in a nutshell, is composed of two main parts. The part without reason, so this is what we share, you can think of, with plants and animals, or non-human animals, as we would say today. So nutrition, growth, all these kinds of things. That's important to us, but they're not uniquely human. So the nutritive part of our soul, the reproductive, all that things that we make copies, and organisms making copies of themselves, that's not unique to any particular level of organism. Important, but not unique. It's when you get to the part of soul that Aristotle says is with reason, or the intellectual part of the soul, all right, this special second part that he divides off from the shared part, this intellectual part, this grasps truths. So in this case now, with the intellectual part of the soul, it grasps truths. So to go back here, right reason is going to involve grasping of truth. Now, here's where Aristotle, definitely follows Plato, and could be a little bit different than what we're used to. But before I dig into what Aristotle says, I just want to point out that there is in Greek philosophy this notion of a part of the soul that knows something or grasps something has to resemble what it grasps. Now, we don't usually talk about this very often in modern epistemology, but we do talk about it we reflect it in an everyday sense. For example, when we say, if you're going out for the evening and you're going to watch a movie or see a play, and you say something like, well, I'm really in the mood for a comedy. If you're in the mood for a comedy, and then you go out to a theater and you see a play or a movie, and you're really in the mood for a comedy, your mindset is in that comedic sort of framework, you're going to not be terribly receptive if you get a drama. If you're in the mood for a drama and you get a comedy, you might say things like, well, yeah, it was really funny, but unfortunately, I just wasn't really in the mood for that. Well, in Aristotle's way of thinking, there's a certain relationship between the part of the soul, or the sort of the disposition of the soul, and the object that it's trying to grasp. So you can think of it in this sense, that the part of the soul that grasps truth of a certain nature is going to have to reflect that nature of truth. Now, this sounds terribly abstract, so let's break it down a little bit. First off, the part with reason is going to be this intellectual part. It grasps truth. But there's going to be different kinds of truths. But before we go into that, let's just make sure we're clear on this part. There's an epistemological principle at work. For X to grasp, and I've written it out, Aristotle doesn't quite put it this way, but he definitely sort of alludes to it in various passages in the Nicomachean Ethics. But Aristotle is saying, for X to grasp Y, for the soul to grasp a truth, the soul, or at least part of it, must resemble the truth that it's trying to grasp. Just like if you really want to get the comedy, you got to have sort of the comedic side or the comedy side of your brain turned on, and so it relates well to its object. It gets it. So as we would say, yeah, those jokes were funny. I kind of understood them in a sense, but I didn't really get them because I just wasn't in the right frame of mind for that. Plato talks a lot like that in the Republic as well. So you can go and have a look, let's say, at the line, the discussions in the Republic of the line and the states of soul and the kinds of truths. And even in the notion of the other metaphors, allegories that he gives for epistemology, there is this principle of like knows like in a more colloquial way. And in even more colloquial is where you say takes one to know one, so that there is a relationship of similarity or resemblance of some kind between the grasper and the graspee. So when the mind knows something, there's a relationship between the very nature of the mind and the very nature of the thing that's grasping. Now that's an important epistemological point. That in the history of philosophy, of course, is largely abandoned, especially when you move out of ancient philosophy and medieval philosophy into what's called modern philosophy. But this is an old epistemological principle that you find throughout the the ancients, more or less. It's certainly in people that were following Plato and Aristotle and up through into the medievals, like Aquinas. You find the same notion of this resemblance between the mind and the object that it grasps. Okay, so back to this notion of the intellectual part of the soul. It grasps truths. The notion of different kinds of truths. Well, it sounds terribly abstract, but it's not all that terribly difficult. The two main kinds of truths that we're going to talk about here are eternal truths and transient truths. Eternal truths are truths that cannot be otherwise. So you can think of eternal truths in the sense of things like mathematics, right? 1 + 1 is equal to 2. That's an eternal truth. It doesn't matter. Now, for Aristotle and some philosophers, they would call them eternal truths. Not all philosophers agree with this, but we're trying to understand Aristotle's picture. In his framework, in his way of thinking, there would be eternal truths like mathematics. So 1 + 1 = 2. In that sense, doesn't matter if anybody knows it. It cannot be otherwise. It doesn't make any sense to say, well, could 1 + 1 not equal 2? That doesn't make any sense. So that's an eternal truth. It's there, independent of us. We don't influence it. We just grasp it. How do we grasp it? Well, that's a certain part of your soul, right? A part with reason, and it's a certain subpart. So the part of your soul with reason divides into two, shall we say, subparts. Subpart that knows eternal truths, so we can call that subpart 1 if you like, and subpart 2, which would know transient truths. So this here, knowing eternal truths, this is like a really high, rational, intellectual side of, like the most intellectual side of the intellectual side of the soul. So you would know that with a part of your soul, that's a subpart of the part of the soul that has reason. So animals, for instance, non-human animals, they wouldn't know these kinds of things because they don't have the part of soul that can know them. That's why so you couldn't teach, in principle, you couldn't teach an animal these kinds of things because it doesn't have the soul part that's necessary to grasp it. And also, there is going to be resemblance, as I said, between the grasper and the graspee. There's got to be some connection there. So these are eternal truths, so it would seem to imply, from your epistemological principle of resemblance, that this part of the soul is going to have some kind of immortality to it. Now, the question of immortality in Aristotle is a debatable one. Does he really think we're immortal or not? Well, he sort of does and he sort of doesn't. Fortunately, we don't have to really dig into that here. But this part of the soul would seem, according to this kind of logical layout that he's got, that at least part of you is kind of immortal, but it would be, a rather thin part, shall we say. It would be the part that grasps eternal truths. That's not going to be your full soul, like your full personality. It would be almost like you just this sort of rational calculator that could survive. So it's not personal. It's not a sense of personal immortality. In any case, that became a big debate in the Middle Ages as how to interpret Aristotle exactly on the nature of this part that grasps eternal truths. But for our purposes here, it's a subpart of the soul with reason. It's going to play a big role later on in the Nicomachean Ethics. The other part, subpart 2, knows transient truths. These are things that could be otherwise. That sounds, again, very complicated, but a transient truth is something that's pretty easy. It can just be a truth that can change. And I can, here's a simple one. Like I say, for instance, I take my cup and I make a statement right now. After I put the cup on the table, I say, the cup is on the table. That's a transient truth. Right? So there would be a part of my soul that gets that truth, which would be different than an eternal truth. And it's transient. Why? Because it can change. If I pick the cup up, then it's no longer true to say the cup is on the table. So these would be, you could call them like, in the sense of like everyday truths, right? Nothing too technical here. It's the kind of truths that we're all familiar with, the kind of truths that would operate in the realm of people doing investigations of the natural world. This would be for Aristotle, eternal ones, investigations of geometry, mathematics, of that kind of stuff, and this is more of the everyday world. All right, so we've got these couple parts of the soul. So the basic thing that Aristotle's doing in Book 6 as an entirety is to try and unpack what right reason is and to start diving into how it's unpacked by its connection to truth, because that's what right reason is dealing with truths now. The earlier parts of the Nicomachean Ethics were dealing with emotions. So what we want to get then is how we put all this together. Okay, so our subpart 1 that knows eternal truths, this is the scientific. So this is Aristotle. We'll call this the scientific part of the soul, and that scientific part has a disposition to know these eternal truths. And with the other part of the soul that knows the transient truths about things that could be otherwise, the calculative. So we've got two major divisions in the part of the soul with reason. And so remember, this is the uniquely human aspect of the soul. So you've got your calculative part. That's the part that also could be deliberative. Remember when Aristotle was talking about choice and deliberation? That's the part that deliberates, and deliberation only deals with things that could be otherwise. So Aristotle says you don't deliberate about eternal truths, because eternal truths cannot be otherwise. You don't deliberate and worry about that. You don't calculate with those. You just know them in a certain kind of sense of knowing and grasping. And these ones you can deliberate about because you're dealing with things that could be otherwise. So the goal here in Book 6, is to sort of sum up, is to figure out these states of souls and how to get them in the best states, because we have to use our right reason in order to shape our characters. And human beings ultimately are a combination of this part of the soul with reason that shapes our emotions and gets everything in order. And of course, don't lose sight of what we're talking about. Why are we trying to do this? Why are we trying to put together all the parts of the soul and get them to work together? Because the ultimate goal is to live a life that exemplifies eudaimonia, the worthwhile life. Well, getting things in order, getting them into harmony, getting your reason on the right track, getting the truths in order to shape all your character, all your emotions will then shape your character virtues. But the idea now is that the intellect has to come in and play its role in order to give some more content now to what we were talking about when we were talking about the character virtues and trying to hit this mean and all that. We need the intellect to step in and help us out to shape things. So we'll be fleshing this out as we go along. Stay tuned for further videos.